Okay, strap in, everybody. Today, we're diving deep into a story of, well, ambition, deception, and, some really big finds. We're talking about the Volkswagen emissions scandal. And let me tell you, this is not your average fender bender. We've got a mountain of research for you guys today. Court documents and even some leaked emails.
Yeah, it's a wild one. 11 million cars, all designed to cheat emissions tests.
The sheer scale of this, I mean, it's mind-boggling.
I know, right? And we're not talking about some struggling startup here. Volkswagen, they were aiming for the top, wanted to be number one in the global car market. They wanted to, revolutionize diesel engines, make them clean, make them powerful. So how did they end up, in this mess?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The story that Volkswagen initially pushed was about a couple of rogue software engineers, the classic a few bad apples. But the truth is, as we'll see, it goes much deeper.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole rogue engineer story. What did they actually claim happened? So Volkswagen initially blamed this thing called a defeat device. It was a piece of software that could detect when a car was being tested for emissions, and then it would switch the engine to a low emissions mode out on the open road. Totally different story.
So they're basically what? Playing games with regulators, trying to pull a fast one.
Exactly. During the test, these cars look, totally clean, meeting all the standards, all the environmental regulations. But then, in real-world driving conditions, pumping out nitrogen oxide at levels, get this, up to 40 times the legal limit.
40 times. That's a huge difference. Were there any warning signs, like any red flags that people missed?
Here's the thing. There were red flags. Evidence suggests that this wasn't just a couple of engineers, working in the basement or something. The problem was known within Volkswagen for years. We're talking internal emails, employees expressing concern, even a quote. One employee wrote, "We won't make it without a few dirty tricks." Chilling stuff.
Okay, that's pretty damning. It sounds like a culture where, cutting corners, even breaking the law, it was tolerated. Maybe even encouraged.
That's the big question we're going to be exploring today. Was this a systemic problem, this culture of winning at all costs, or was it just, a few bad apples making bad choices?
And what about the people involved, the engineers? Can you imagine being in that position? The pressure to deliver, to meet these crazy goals must have been immense. But at the same time, knowing that what you're doing is wrong.
It's a fascinating ethical dilemma. How much responsibility do individuals have, especially when they're following orders? Especially when they're, trying to keep their jobs.
Right, the classic just following orders defense.
Yeah.
But does that really hold up in a case like this?
It's debatable. Volkswagen actually offered amnesty to employees who came forward with information, almost like they were trying to incentivize people to spill the beans.
Interesting. So on one hand, they're offering amnesty. They understand that some ethical boundaries were crossed. But on the other hand, they're pushing this rogue engineer narrative. Seems like a mixed message, doesn't it?
It does. It raises the question, did Volkswagen really believe this was an isolated incident, or were they just trying to control the narrative, trying to minimize the damage?
Okay, so things are starting to unravel. We've got this defeat device,
Yeah.
evidence of internal knowledge, a company scrambling to explain itself, what happened next. Did the truth, did it come out?
Oh, it came out. And the fallout, well, it was huge. But before we get into all that, let's take a step back for a second and think about the human side of this. These were real people making decisions, facing consequences.
Right. We're talking resignations, investigations, even potential jail time for some executives. This wasn't just some abstract corporate drama. It had very real consequences for people.
And those consequences, they went way beyond Volkswagen itself. Remember, we're talking 11 million cars, polluting the air we breathe. Think about the impact on people's health, on the environment. This was not a victimless crime.
So let's talk about that fallout. What kind of penalties did Volkswagen face?
Well, get ready for some big numbers. On top of that $4.3 billion criminal fine, they also had to cough up $28 billion in civil settlements.
$28 billion. That's more than the GDP of some countries.
Yeah, gives you a sense of the scale of this thing. And it wasn't just about money. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee their operations for 3 years. Think of it like being put on probation. They had to prove that they were committed to change.
So they were forced to, reform their ethics, their compliance structure, basically overhaul their entire culture. That's a pretty big intervention.
It was. And it raises a big question. Can a company really change its culture after something like this? And how do we prevent these kinds of scandals from happening again?
Great questions. and ones we'll definitely explore further. But before we move on, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the human cost. We talked about the executives, but what about the everyday employees at Volkswagen? How did this impact their lives?
That's a really important point, and honestly, it's one that often gets overlooked. Imagine working for a company that's suddenly, at the center of this global scandal. There's the fear of losing your job, the damage to your reputation, the sense of betrayal, disillusionment.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly tough on those employees, especially the ones who had no part in the deception, caught in the crossfire, their livelihoods, their reputations, tarnished by the actions of a few.
Exactly, and it just shows the ripple effect of unethical behavior, how it can impact so many lives in ways we don't even consider.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here.
Yeah.
We've got the initial deception, the attempted cover-up, the massive fallout, the human cost. But there's still so much more to unpack.
Oh, yeah. We've just scratched the surface.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Volkswagen emissions scandal.
We've been laying out the facts of this case for you, but now I kind of want to shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture.
Yeah, this wasn't just some, random incident, right? It feels like it points to some larger issues. Corporate culture, that pressure to succeed, sometimes, at any cost.
You're absolutely right. Volkswagen's goal to become the world's #1 automaker, it put this immense pressure on everyone. I mean, from the CEO all the way down to the engineers. And that pressure, it created this environment where ethical boundaries, well, they became blurred. And, as we've seen, ultimately
It's
cross.
like they created this monster and then they just couldn't control it. They set these huge, ambitious targets, but they didn't provide the resources or the ethical framework to actually achieve them legitimately.
And that's where this whole concept of corporate culture comes in. It's not just about, slogans and mission statements. It's about the values that actually guide decision making, the unspoken rules that determine what's acceptable behavior and what's not.
So in Volkswagen's case, the culture was so focused on hitting those growth targets that it created a blind spot, right, for ethical considerations.
Exactly. It became this win at all costs mentality where the ends justify the means. And that's a dangerous, dangerous path for any organization.
It's interesting because we see this pattern in so many corporate scandals.
Mm.
Enron, WorldCom, Wells Fargo. I mean, the list goes on. It's like this cautionary tale that just keeps repeating itself.
And the consequences are always devastating, not just for the companies themselves, but for their employees, their customers, the public.
Thinking about this from the perspective of those engineers, it must have been a really, really tough spot to be in. On the one hand, they've got this pressure to deliver results, meet these crazy goals. But on the other hand, they know what they're being asked to do is wrong. You have to wonder what was going through their minds.
It's a classic ethical dilemma, right?
Yeah.
And it really highlights the importance of having a strong moral compass and the courage to speak up when you see something wrong. Do you think you would have had the guts to say something?
Honestly, I don't know. It's easier said than done, right? Especially when you're talking about challenging your superiors, people who have power over your career. Maybe some did speak up and were ignored, silenced. What do you think?
That's definitely a possibility. It takes a lot of guts to be a whistleblower. You risk your job, your reputation, even, your personal safety in some cases. But sometimes it's the only way to stop something bad from happening or to expose wrongdoing that's already occurred.
That's true. And it makes you think about the responsibility of organizations to create a culture where whistleblowing is encouraged, not punished. They need to have clear channels for reporting concerns. And they need to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. Otherwise, people will just stay silent. And the problems will just, fester.
Exactly. And that's what happened at Volkswagen. There were warning signs. There were people who knew that something was wrong, but they didn't feel safe speaking up. What if they had, though? Could they have stopped this whole thing before it blew up?
It's almost like they were trapped in a system that made it impossible to do the right thing. It's a chilling thought. Good people forced to make bad choices because of the environment they're in. What can we, as listeners, learn from this? How can we make sure we're not contributing to that kind of toxic culture in our own workplaces?
That's the crucial question. We often focus on individual responsibility, but we also need to recognize the power of systems to shape our choices.
So how can we, change systems to make them more ethical? Where do we even begin?
Well, for starters, we need to be clear about our values. Make sure that those values are reflected in our policies, our procedures. We need to reward ethical behavior, not just results. And we need to hold people accountable when they cross the line, regardless of their position or their power.
It sounds like it requires like a fundamental shift in mindset, a move away from this win at all cost mentality towards a more holistic view of success. That includes ethical considerations, maybe even rethinking what success even means. What do you think?
I agree. And that's not an easy shift to make. It requires strong leadership, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a commitment to doing what's right, even when it's difficult.
Makes you wonder if all the fallout from this scandal, the fines, the investigations, the reputational damage, was it enough to force that kind of change at Volkswagen?
You mentioned earlier that a federal monitor was appointed to oversee their operations, right?
Yes, for 3 years. They implemented a number of reforms, including appointing a new CEO, overhauling their compliance program, and creating a whistleblower hotline. They even launched a global ethics training program for all employees.
So it sounds like they were taking some, serious steps in the right direction. But is it enough? Can a company really change its culture that deeply? I mean, how do you measure that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Whether those reforms were enough to truly change the culture at Volkswagen, well, it remains to be seen. It takes time to rebuild trust. And it takes sustained effort to embed ethical values into, every aspect of an organization. It's like they have this long road ahead of them, a journey of redemption. Do you think they can make it?
It's a journey worth watching. Because if Volkswagen can successfully transform itself, it could serve as a model for other companies struggling with similar challenges. What would that look like? Can they regain the public's trust?
That would be an incredible feat to prove that it is possible to achieve both success and integrity.
And that would be a powerful lesson for us all.
So we've talked about the intense pressure cooker environment of Volkswagen, the tough ethical dilemmas faced by those engineers, the role of corporate culture, the importance of systemic change. But there's another piece of this puzzle we haven't really explored yet, right? The role of regulators and the legal system in holding companies accountable for their actions. That's a whole other can of worms.
It is. It's a crucial piece because ultimately it's the threat of punishment, the fear of legal consequences that often motivates companies to behave ethically. At least that's the idea.
And in this case, the punishment was pretty significant. You mentioned a $4.3 billion criminal fine, a $28 billion civil settlement, multiple executives facing criminal charges. That's got to send a message, right?
It certainly does. And it highlights the importance of having strong regulatory bodies with the power to investigate wrongdoing and impose meaningful penalties. If there were no consequences, who knows how long this deception would go on?
Otherwise, companies might be tempted to cut corners, knowing they can get away with it. What does that say about our system?
That's a big question. And it goes beyond this particular case. It makes you think about the balance of power between corporations and regulators, about the role of government in ensuring ethical behavior, about, the very nature of capitalism itself.
Whoa, those are some deep waters.
Yeah,
Maybe we should save that discussion for another deep dive.
perhaps. But it's worth pondering.
Agreed. So back to Volkswagen. You mentioned that some executives were facing criminal charges. What happened to them? Did they serve time? Were they held personally accountable? I mean, we can't just let the company take the fall, right? These were real people making decisions that had real-world consequences.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to this crucial question. Who is ultimately responsible? Is it the company as a whole or the individuals who made the decisions? This isn't just about Volkswagen. It's a question that applies to every corporation, every organization. And the answer, unfortunately, it's not always clear-cut.
Okay, so we're diving into some murky legal waters here. This is where things get really complex, right? I mean,
Yeah.
You've got corporate law, criminal law, international law. It's enough to make your head spin.
It is, and it's important to remember that the legal process, well, it's often slow and complicated. It's not always about, right and wrong,
Yeah.
but about evidence, procedure, legal precedent. Sometimes justice can feel elusive, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it.
So what happened? Did anyone actually go to jail for this? Did those executives face any real consequences? I mean, resignations and fines are one thing, but what about actual punishment?
Well, that's a story that's still unfolding. The legal battles are ongoing, and the outcomes are uncertain. But one thing is clear. This case has set a precedent. It's shown that corporate executives can be held personally liable for their actions, even in complex cases like this, and that's a significant development.
It's a victory for accountability, for sure. But it also raises some tough questions. How do we balance the need for individual responsibility with the realities of corporate decision-making? How do we prevent these kinds of scandals from happening in the first place? And how do we ensure that justice is served when they do?
Those are questions that, we'll continue to grapple with as we move forward. But for now, let's take a break and regroup. When we come back in part 3, we'll delve into the aftermath of this scandal, the lasting impacts on Volkswagen, the automotive industry, and even on us, the consumers.
Welcome back, everyone. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the Volkswagen emissions scandal.
We've talked a lot about the legal battles, the search for accountability.
Yeah, did those executives, did they face any real consequences? I mean, companies get fined, sure, but what about the people who made the decisions?
Right. Does corporate punishment actually equal personal accountability? Well, in Volkswagen's case, some individuals definitely did face the music. Several engineers, managers, they were hit with criminal charges, both in the US and Germany.
So it wasn't just a slap on the wrist for the company. There were real consequences for, the people involved.
Absolutely. Some lower-level employees even ended up serving prison sentences. A real reminder that cutting corners can have serious, serious personal consequences.
Wow. But what about the top guys, the executives? Did they ever see the inside of a jail cell?
Well, that's where things get a little messy. Remember Martin Winterkorn, the CEO at the time?
Yeah.
He resigned pretty quickly after the scandal broke, but he's always maintained that he didn't know anything about the cheating.
Come on, the CEO of a major car company doesn't know about a core part of their business. That's hard to believe.
You're not alone in thinking that. German prosecutors weren't buying it either. They charged Winterkorn with fraud and market manipulation.
Uh-oh.
His trial has been going on for years, and if he's convicted, he could face up to 10 years in prison.
10 years, that's a long time, especially for a white-collar crime.
It is. And it sends a message that corporate wrongdoing won't be tolerated, even at the highest levels. But whether that message is enough to prevent future misconduct, well, that's a whole other question.
So while those legal battles play out, let's zoom out a bit. What about Volkswagen itself? How did the company try to, rebuild its image after this huge blow?
Damage control went into overdrive. They apologized, they paid out those massive settlements, and they promised to become a leader in sustainability. They even changed their slogan to, get this, transforming mobility.
Transforming mobility, kind of a bold statement after getting caught red-handed with emissions trickery.
Hey, you got to give them credit for trying, right? They invested billions into developing electric vehicles, pledged to become carbon neutral.
So classic case of trying to turn a crisis into an opportunity.
Exactly. But rebuilding trust, it's a long, long road. Consumers were, understandably skeptical. And the whole scandal really cast a shadow over the diesel engine market.
Yeah, I remember reading that diesel car sales just tanked after this all came out.
It was a major turning point. The scandal kind of exposed the limitations of diesel, and I think it accelerated the shift towards electric vehicles. Some might even argue that, in the long run, it forced the industry to clean up its act.
So maybe an unintended consequence, a silver lining to this whole mess.
Possibly. But we can't forget about the damage that was done. Millions of cars pumping out extra pollutants, contributing to air quality problems, health issues. That's a tough legacy to erase.
And what about regulations? Did the scandal change how emissions are tested, how they're enforced?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Regulators around the world, they woke up. Well, they were pretty weak. They started implementing stricter tests, more real-world driving conditions, and tougher penalties for violations.
So Volkswagen's deception ultimately led to a more robust system, hopefully one that's harder to trick.
That's the goal. But it's a constant battle. The industry is always pushing the boundaries, finding new ways to optimize performance, to increase efficiency. And regulators, they need to stay ahead of the game, making sure those advancements don't come at the cost of public health and the environment.
Sounds like a high-stakes game of cat and mouse.
Yeah.
With the health of the planet on the line.
It is. And the Volkswagen scandal, it's a stark reminder of what's at stake. A cautionary tale, both for corporations and regulators. A reminder that shortcuts, complacency, they can have huge consequences.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this question. What does it all mean for us, the consumers? What can we learn from this whole thing?
That's a great question. I think the biggest takeaway is we can't just blindly trust companies. We have to be informed, ask questions, hold them accountable for their actions.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is in order.
Absolutely. Don't just accept marketing claims at face value. Do your research, read reviews, and support companies that have a real commitment to ethical and sustainable practices.
And what about our own choices, our own actions? Can we, help prevent future scandals like this?
Without a doubt, every purchase we make, every product we use, it's a vote for a particular way of doing business. We can choose to support companies that prioritize transparency, sustainability, social responsibility. We can demand better from the products we buy, the services we use, the companies we invest in.
So the power's in our hands.
It is. But with power comes responsibility. We need to be informed, make conscious choices, and hold ourselves and those in power accountable for creating a more ethical, more sustainable future.
That's a powerful message, and a good way to end our deep dive into the Volkswagen emissions scandal. It's a story that's complex, it's multifaceted, and ultimately it's a reflection of our own choices and values. So as you go about your day, dear listener, remember the lessons we've uncovered. Be curious, be critical, and be a force for positive change, because the future, in many ways, is in our hands.